Okay, I think most participants are connected, or still a few to connect, but I think in the interest of time, we can get started with the session. Again, to welcome everyone to day 3 of GCA's Masterclass on Climate Resilient PPPs. On Monday, we had the opening ceremony of this Masterclass, as well as the keynote lecture from Stefan Holgate. Yesterday, during the morning, we had the presentations from Keys as well. We had the presentation, on climate risk and resilience assessment of infrastructure, as well as decision making under uncertainty. And I think it was very useful discussions and great to see your participation. So we had the presentation with Jiali from the World Bank talking about the resilient rating system, as well as from Kees from the Ministry of Infrastructure of the Netherlands, talking about some of the Dutch experience on those topics. Today, we will be discussing innovative financing mechanisms for resilient infrastructure, as well as how to integrate nature-based solutions. As usual, we will have the first part of the sessions with the main presentations of 2 key speakers, and followed by the group activities later. So without further ado, I would like to give the words to David, our moderator of this masterclass, who will be introducing our speakers for today. David, the floor is yours. You're still mute.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I would like to welcome you again to the 3rd session of the GCA presentation. We have 2 very interesting speakers lined up who are going to talk, as was mentioned, on mechanisms for resilient infrastructure as well as nature-based solutions. We have Dr. Davies, Dr. Craig Davies, who is going to be the first presenter. Dr. Davies has led the EBRD's climate investment operations in areas of climate resilience, climate-related financial risk, and climate corporation governance. He also leads a team that works with businesses, financial institutions, utilities, and government agencies who are working to understand how they are affected by climate-related risks and how to integrate climate resilience and climate corporate governance into their business operations. Covering the infrastructure, corporate and financial sectors, the business area led by Dr. Davies entails using climate change information to inform innovative investment design, technical cooperation, and targeted policy dialogue. Prior to joining the EBRD in 2006, Dr. Davies held various sustainable development roles with the UK government after starting his career in environmental impacts research. And Dr. Davies holds a PhD in environmental technology from Imperial College London. We welcome you, and we'd like you to take the floor and start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for the introduction, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's a pleasure to be here today, and a pleasure to be able to speak as part of this very exciting event, linked to some really innovative and important work that's been developed by the Global Centre on Adaptation in collaboration with a wide range of stakeholders, including the EBRD. And we're really pleased to be a partner in this process and to be a partner in the work of the Global Centre on Adaptation more broadly. What I would like to do today is maybe to start by telling you a little bit about the EBRD, and then to move into a brief presentation on the subject of innovative financing mechanisms for climate resilient infrastructure. 2 things I'd like to say from the outset is I think this topic is hugely important. One, because of the vital role of infrastructure in climate resilient development. As David mentioned in his introductory comments, we at EBRD focus very firmly on climate resilience as part of our overall green and climate agenda. Over the past decade, we've financed more than 320 climate resilience investments with a total business volume of around 9 billion euros, and within that about almost 3 billion euros of adaptation finance within that business volume. About 80% of that has been in infrastructure, and that's an important point. It's not an accident. It's because infrastructure, climate resilient infrastructure, is vital for supporting the climate resilient development pathways that we want our countries to have. It's also a sign that climate resilience really matters for infrastructure. The long-lived assets, the long investment cycles, the inherent exposure to physical climate change impacts of many types of infrastructure mean that it's really important to get infrastructure on the agenda. So let's move on to the slides. I'm just going to start sharing my presentation. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover in this session. So I want to talk about physical climate risk. And I want to talk about physical climate risk not only as a threat, as a negative thing, but also as something which, if managed properly and if assessed correctly, can generate, in fact, opportunities for developing new types of financing instruments, especially as financing institutions start getting better at collecting information about physical climate risks. And I'd like to maybe look a little bit at what that means for infrastructure investing and what it means for crowding in private finance for infrastructure investment, because that's another thing that's really important about this product coming from the GCA. How can we crowd in private finance for infrastructure investments? We know that mobilizing private finance is a top priority for the climate agenda in general. We know that at COP26 next month, the mobilization of private finance is going to be an absolutely key topic. So it's really timely that this work has come out that can, I think, provide some very practical lessons and guidance on how PPPs can be very important instruments for crowding in that private finance for better, more climate resilient infrastructure. But I want to look at how understanding physical climate risk can be part of that process, and also to give a case study of one financing instrument that we developed at EBRD, a climate resilient bond, that really benefited from this better understanding of physical climate risk in financing operations. So very quickly, I'm not going to read this slide out because it's a story that I think we're probably all quite familiar with, which is that we are living in an era of a changing climate. The evidence is now unequivocal. The scientific consensus is very, very strong. We are living in an era of a changing and more variable climate. We've seen, for example, earlier this year, the IPCC reiterating in a really stark way the reality of climate change that's happening now, and it affects human activity in all sorts of ways. But what we're also seeing, is that climate change is also a source of financial risk. And we're seeing this, that this is no longer theoretical, this is happening. We're seeing businesses suffering severe financial consequences from physical climate change impacts. There's some news headlines on the screen of, for example, the world's first climate-related bankruptcy, which was the electricity utility PG&E in California, and they faced bankruptcy, I think, 2 years ago, specifically due to their exposure to physical climate risks. So this is no longer something that we're reading about in textbooks, we're reading about it in financial newspapers. It's happening, and it's really becoming very material to the financial system and to many businesses and infrastructure owners in the financial system. So I'm sure many of you have heard about things like the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And what this means is that we're now seeing that financial supervisors, financial regulators, policymakers, central banks, and the financial system and business in broader terms are really moving very quickly on the whole subject of understanding, assessing, and disclosing physical climate risk, climate-related financial risk in a very serious way. And you can see from the red circle that I've inserted on top of the TCFD diagram there, that this includes physical climate risk. So we're now seeing a big shift towards businesses, financial institutions, financial regulators, all demanding more information about physical climate risk. What is it? Why is it important? How is it material? How is it affecting businesses? How is it affecting finance? So this is a major shift that we're seeing in the financial system. Now, I want to then talk about EBRD for a little bit. We are a multilateral development bank. We're quite private sector focused. We lend mainly to the private sector. We lend on commercial terms. So we are sitting on the fence between development and commercial finance. We operate in an interesting region of mainly middle-income countries from North Africa to the Middle East to the former Soviet Union and further east again into Central Asia. So it's an interesting region, highly exposed to physical climate risks. Our region includes some of the world's most water-stressed countries, for example. And what we've been doing is collecting a lot of information on physical climate change risks in our operations. We signed up to the TCFD 3 years ago, and that's made us even more focused on collecting a lot of information from our portfolio, from our pipelines, how our investments are exposed to physical climate risks, and then also how we can adjust our investment design, how we can deliver our finance in a way that better addresses physical climate risks. So the point I want to make here is that this shift towards collecting more and better information about physical climate risk can be very powerful. And when financial institutions start amassing this information across their portfolios, and they start getting a fuller picture of how their portfolios look in relation to physical climate risk, this is very powerful. And you're able then to pick out of your portfolio certain sectors, certain geographies. You're able then to anticipate how you need to invest differently to reduce your exposure to physical climate risk. It enables you to go upstream in your project planning cycle to start thinking, how will we make that investment climate resilient? We know that that power station is in a location that's exposed to physical climate risk. How can we make sure that when we finance it, we work with the client to make sure that it's climate resilient? So it's a very powerful tool. And what we have found with that tool is that it enables us to innovate financially in terms of financing instruments. I'm going to move to my case study, which is about a climate resilient bond instrument. Now, this is a topic on which we've partnered very closely with other organizations, including the Global Center on Adaptation and also the Climate Bonds Initiative. And 2 years ago, the Climate Bonds Initiative issued a set of principles for climate resilient bonds. And this was building on the idea that the green bond market is an enormous pool of capital. You know, it's become an enormous $1 trillion marketplace for green finance. How can some of that green finance be leveraged for climate resilience investment? And they came up with principles, and as you can see from the diagram at the bottom of the screen, those principles really revolve around collecting good information about physical climate impacts and climate resilience in investment portfolios. And because of the work we'd been doing on collecting that information, we thought, let's use these principles to structure a climate resilience bond. Let's demonstrate how financial institutions can access bond markets to raise private capital for climate resilience investment. Very pleased that we were able to further this work with the Global Center on Adaptation. The guide you can see on the top right-hand side was issued last week, and we're very proud of that going public through the GCA. Very briefly, we were then able to go through our portfolio and assemble a sub-portfolio of climate resilient investments in which we had thoroughly assessed physical climate risks and also then designed the projects differently to make them climate resilient in response to those physical climate risks. So we were able to draw those investments out and, if you like, package them together into a bond issuance, which we then took to the capital markets. So we made an inaugural climate resilience bond issuance in September 2019. We took this carefully selected subsection of our portfolio to capital markets and we offered it as a bond issuance. The response was much greater than we expected. We went intending to raise $500 million from capital markets, and the bond was oversubscribed. So more investors wanted to invest in this bond than we had originally anticipated. So we ended up raising $700 million from capital markets. You can see in the top right-hand side where the finance came from. It came from a wide range of mainly institutional investors, insurance companies, pension funds, asset managers, for example, with a reasonable geographical distribution as well. So this was private finance that was raised for these climate resilience investments. And you can also see where the money went. So the proceeds of that bond were used to finance investments in a range of countries in the EBRD region. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's focus on the right-hand side because that tells you the sectors. And you can see that most of it went to infrastructure. In fact, I think the vast majority went to infrastructure investment. So this is highly relevant to the topic of this discussion, which is how can we raise private finance for climate resilient infrastructure investments. And our experience with this climate resilience bond is we think it's a very helpful stepping stone towards having a wider discussion with capital markets, with private investors about bringing private finance into climate resilience investments. And also, very importantly, it's raising awareness amongst these sorts of investors as to what climate resilience is and why climate resilient infrastructure matters. Because we had some very interesting discussions with these investors, some of whom were very new to the subject of climate resilience and wanted to know about it. So that was a very important, I think, opportunity for opening a dialogue with private sector institutional investors on the importance of climate resilient investment, including infrastructure. Just finally, just to say what we've done since then, that the initial issuance of $700 million has been tapped. That means we've gone back and we've done more kind of smaller issuances on the back of it. So we've now raised a total of $1.15 billion of private finance against climate resilience investments. Again, most of them infrastructure. And it's also been an important milestone for broadening the discussion about the relevance and the potential applicability of the green bond market for leveraging private finance for climate resilience investment. Just final point, we're delighted that the GCA has been such a strong partner in this work. We've been working very closely with some of Danilo's colleagues under the finance work stream of the GCA, but I think it's also highly relevant to the infrastructure theme. And finally, just to say that the PPP guidance that's being launched is so helpful for this sort of work, because to have that clear guidance relevant to private investors on how investments can be structured in a way that makes infrastructure climate resilient, that draws in private capital, is very important and indeed extremely useful for having better prospects for engaging private investors in climate resilient infrastructure investments. So I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone over time, and if there is time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Craig. We do have enough time for questions. I'm just asking that any of the attendees, if you have questions, if you can start putting them into the chat box so that I can moderate and direct them. And I will give you the opportunity to ask Craig your question directly once you've put it in the chat box. Craig, I just have some questions for you as we wait for questions to appear. You talked about, the private sector looking at, and the public sector looking at upstream, preparation and finance planning, etc. How easy, I can see where governments can start the planning because they're looking at certain specific instruction, upstream. But by the time they make the announcements to the private sector, there's a situation that obviously there's a bit of a delay, that, the private sector is now being invited to something that's been largely decided or visioned or, planned. What ways can you engage with the private sector to get greater interaction from them and to get them on board? Because I know that, I live in the United States and there are even private sector companies here who are still climate skeptics. You hear it on the news all the time, etc. So it's a very open-ended question and I'll pause there, but maybe you can just give us some insights into that. We'd appreciate that.
That's a great question, David. Thanks. I think I'll try to answer it in two parts. I think where we are talking about investments, infrastructure investments that are developed, that are originated on the public side, and with the expectation of bringing in private finance later on, this is a really important point, and it really brings home the importance of good project preparation. And how it's necessary to have the tools and the capacities upstream on the public side to develop investments in a way that when the private finance comes in, that the climate resilience, nature of those investments is carried through. So this is, I think, speaking exactly to the purpose that the PPP climate resilient infrastructure guidance is intended to fulfill, because we see this a lot. We see that when infrastructure investments intended to be PPPs are developed on the public side, there isn't always the analysis, the thinking about physical climate impacts and climate resilience that's needed, and that needs to be done upstream on the public side in order to bringing ensure that when the private finance comes in, it's delivered in a way that results in climate resilient investment. So this is a gap, and I think that's why this work was needed to start filling that gap. But I also want to just say that on the private side, I think there are differences between different sectors and different industries. We see some sectors, I would say hydropower and ports, for example, where the whole industry now is pretty tuned in to the relevance of physical climate risk. And the industry itself, including private sector participants, are already very aware of physical climate change impacts being real and being material. So, for example, on the hydropower side, we've seen many hydropower firms, including purely private ones, really investing heavily in better analytics and understanding and modeling, for example, of how physical climate change will affect hydropower generation. We've seen organizations like the International Hydropower Association, which is a fully private organization, doing really interesting work on providing guidance and sharing knowledge amongst its members on climate resilience in the hydropower sector. Same for ports. We've seen a lot of port operators, because they can't deny it. I mean, they look at ports that were built 100 years ago and they see that the tide is now, the water's in a different place. So it can't be denied in those sectors. So again, we've seen a lot of port operators, including private port operators, and a lot of industry associations like PIANC, for example, which is the World Ports Association, developing guidance and analysis on climate change impacts and climate resilience. So in some sectors that are really exposed to physical climate risk, the private sector is already moving. So there are differences between sectors.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. And, especially if we're looking at public-private partnerships, that involves both the public and the private sector, and they need to be attuned to one another. America Bendita, you have a question for Craig. Please, if you make sure your camera's on and unmute, and if you could ask the question, I'd appreciate it.
Good morning. Many thanks for the presentation. Well, I think with the question that David made, you answer a little bit my question, but I can also make it again. So could you explain us a little bit how the challenges that to generate new innovative finance from public and private sources, the challenges you have faced with this? I know that knowledge is one of them, and investing in this it's like a long term, so it's difficult for people to engage. But can you tell us your experience with these challenges? Thank you.
I mean, it's a great question. We could discuss it all day because it's a really deep question, but let me try and give just a few quicker reflections. One is, there's no shortage of capital for infrastructure investments. I mean, the capital is out there. The question is the terms, the pricing, the risk appetite, but I think also the project preparation, as I say, is a real stumbling block. The capital is out there, the projects aren't there, and that's what we find a lot, is that the bottleneck towards scaling up investment in climate resilient infrastructure is not necessarily finding the investors. The bottleneck is the project preparation, right? The really good, well-designed projects coming to the market. So I think that focus on project preparation, and like I said earlier, building capacities, including on the public side, to develop really well-designed climate resilient infrastructure investments, so that the upstream analysis is done. These projects these investments and these infrastructure systems are designed using really good analytics of physical climate projections and practical ways of integrating those projections and those analytics into the specifics of investment design. That's a really big bottleneck. And in a sense, I see that maybe as being it's bigger bottleneck than the availability of the private sector finance. If we could have more emphasis on good project preparation of climate resilient infrastructure, I think that this would do a lot to unblock the financing flows. Having said that, there are clearly, especially for certain countries, especially for lower income countries with worse credit ratings, there are other obstacles to access to finance, which are more about, for example, pricing, about the affordability. the private finance sources, about also the risk profile and the risk appetite of investors. So there's also a need for intervention on that front. There's also a need to be looking at how these investments can be de-risked, how they can also, where appropriate, be supported by by concessionality adjustments where necessary in order to unblock poorer countries' access to climate resilient infrastructure investment. So project preparation, yes, but then I think also there's a need for international financial institutions like us and many others to be looking at how we can de-risk and also support affordable pricing of these investments, especially for lower income countries where the investment needs are greater, but the barriers to market access are also greater.
Thank you very much. You've touched on risk, and that's a question that I'd like to ask a further question. As you identify risk for projects, that could be something that actually drives investors away, in the sense of if you do a very good job in identifying the risk and try and come up with risk management strategies, etc. Can you tell us how you would maintain a balance so that your risk analysis doesn't actually scare away investors? It sounds rather crazy, but I'm working on a project, for example, in the Maldives, which is one of the most at-risk nations in the world. The highest piece of land of that country is only about 3 meters above sea level. And when you start hearing stories about in 50 years' time, the country is going to be in great danger of excessive flooding, etc. Why would somebody then invest in infrastructure in that type of scenario? I don't know if that question makes sense, but risk is a big element, and risk sharing and appropriate allocation of risk is a big element of PPPs.
That's another great question. So let's start by saying that I think that the drive towards more systematic climate risk disclosure, and it is becoming more mandatory. You may be aware that many countries now are moving towards mandatory climate risk disclosure in financing operations. In fact, the G7 back in June committed towards mandatory TCFD disclosure across all G7 economies. So that's the direction of travel, that everybody now is being asked, and in some cases, required on a mandatory basis to disclose information about climate-related financial risk. And one thing that's doing is that it's creating more of a level playing field. Everybody will one day everybody will have to do this at some point. And that means now that I think from an investor's point of view, what's more risky is when you don't know, in a sense, not having any information and not having any disclosure is seen as risk in itself, because if an entity is not making any effort to disclose the physical or the climate risks, including the physical climate risks that it sees in its operations, then as an investor, you're really going to ask why. And I need to see more transparency before I can make a decision on whether I invest. I think, though, you've maybe inadvertently touched on an important point, that we need to think about risks and opportunities together. And I've been talking about risk, and what we really should be talking about is risk and opportunity, because the correct identification, assessment, and where possible management of a risk can also then generate opportunities, because then there's greater transparency. Investors can go in with their eyes open and they say, okay, we understand there are physical climate risks, but we have an idea of what they are. We have an idea of whether they're material. We have an idea of their extent, and we have an idea of how they can be managed. So I think we need to find ways of looking at risks and opportunities side by side, because a well-managed risk can become an opportunity. But finally, I think you've raised a more difficult point, which is that it may well be that in certain geographies we have kind of deep residual risks that are beyond the reach of private investors to manage and address, and that is where we need deeper intervention. And I think that is where we have a stronger case for then concessional intervention. Because we need to be realistic that there are limits, and there will be certain geographies, certain sectors. You've mentioned the Maldives, for example, where there will be a deep residual risk that needs another kind of intervention, either from international institutions, possibly a deeper form of concessionality to address the deep and serious needs there that probably won't be addressed by the market alone.
Thank you. I seem to be asking all the questions today. Thanks, great. Anna Schatzkowska, you've posed a question. Could you please ask the question? Remember to unmute and to turn on your camera. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. It was very interesting to hear about this climate resilient bonds. And could you please say a few words about the other financial mechanisms of EBRD aimed at resilience? Especially, it's interesting for me how it works in developing economies. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, for the question. I'll try to give a fairly brief response. Just briefly, EBRD, as I said, we're mainly private sector oriented. We do most of our lending to the private sector. And even when we lend to the public sector, it's only for public sector investments that support private sector growth. So things like better roads, better water supplies, better telecommunications, the vital infrastructure that you need to have a properly functioning economy and private sector. So we do a lot of infrastructure investment, as I've mentioned, and we are increasingly looking at how we can make sure that we mainstream climate resilience into our infrastructure investment. But we also do other types of investment. We lend, for example, to corporates, we lend to businesses, and increasingly we're looking at how we can support our corporate clients in understanding and managing climate risk better. So to give a specific example, we're working with some of our agribusiness clients. These are businesses involved in the food value chain, the agri-food value chain, and they're often exposed to physical climate risks, for example, droughts or extreme weather events or worsening water stress, for example. So we're working with those kinds of clients to help them get better at understanding and assessing and managing physical climate risk in their operations. And we also do a lot of lending to the financial sector through financial intermediaries, for example, local banks in the countries where we invest. And often also there, we're working with our local banks increasingly to help them to get better at understanding physical climate risk and other types of climate risk in their operations. Plus, we also put finance through those banks to finance specific sorts of technologies that can be relevant for climate resilience. For example, credit lines for things like drip irrigation, for example, through local banks. But lastly, we are also looking at, on the policy side, how we can work with some of our countries on things like their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, also their long-term strategies under the Paris Agreement. These are the blueprints that countries are developing under the Paris Agreement for low carbon and climate resilient growth. And we're also looking at how we can engage with those countries to help them develop better long-term plans for how they will achieve climate resilient growth. And then importantly, how we can link that to investment and private sector development.
Thank you very much, Craig. It's always fun to ask questions, but it's also different when you receive the questions at the other end and you have to think very quickly on your feet, and you did that wonderfully. So I appreciate your very succinct answers that were, I think, very helpful and very illuminative of the presentation you made. We're going to move on to the next speaker now. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Ramon. He is from the Asian Development Bank. Ramon Abracosa is an independent consultant at the ADB. He's worked all over the region. I was amazed when I read his bio that he has worked on over 100 projects worldwide. And so we are really looking forward to hearing your insights that you can share with us about these projects and your vast knowledge on specifically the topic that you're going to be looking at, which is integrating nature-based solutions into infrastructure. So welcome, and I'm going to hand the floor over to you, Ramon, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, David, for introducing me. And let me just quickly share my screen. And greetings, everyone, from Manila. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are joining this forum. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to GCA for this opportunity. The topic that I will speak to is integrating nature-based solutions. We'll abbreviate that as NBS in infrastructure. And as the session has been billed in the program as an ADB presentation, I have crafted it so that it describes to you ADB's overall approach, the framework that it is testing and continuing to refine, some of the tools that's being applied as well, and a case on a bank project involving also a PPP modality prospect. This is not to say or to imply at all that ADB is necessarily a leader already in nature-based solutions. It's aspiring to, but this is a new area, and the challenges facing the bank's attempts to be a leader in this field is something that is worth discussing in this forum. Perhaps a common challenge to other development financing institutions, including the ERDB. So my outline is a four-part presentation, and I'll start with a quick overview of this NDS solution so that we just have a context for it, and follow that with ADB's approach to this NDS solutions. Then I take you through a quick run through of what the ADB means by a system-based approach to NDS, and illustrate, well, not all, but some of those basic elements in a case study on urban infrastructure planning. It's a greenfield city development in the Philippines. But the more interesting one for you perhaps would be the fourth one, which is what challenges do we face, ADB among them, in financing institutions in actually mainstreaming NDS in infrastructure. So the whole title of this presentation is indeed, in fact, a challenge, which I hope we will have an opportunity to brainstorm in the coming slide. So just by way of defining it, the NDS refers to a family of approaches that are designed to systematically include ecological processes within infrastructure management systems. And they include natural features as well as engineered systems. So both green and hybrid projects, and indeed ADB's approach to nature-based solutions is not to develop it standalone, but to incorporate it in conventional, if you like to call them, gray infrastructure. And there are a variety of terminologies: green infra, nature positive measures, building or engineering with nature. All of these we will refer to collectively here as NDS. And may interest you from a recent staff survey at ADB, there's a widespread sense that traditional approaches to development is no longer appropriate, and especially in the context of threats and uncertainties brought about by climate change. And in the context of climate change, NDS has the advantage of being perceived as having greater flexibility and adaptability relative to conventional hard infrastructure. Such adaptability is seen as key to the future of ADB finance investments. And this is, of course, in combination with the bank's other core objectives of building inclusive prosperity, sustainability, and overall resilience. Under the bank's strategy for the decade, Strategy 2030, at least 75 of the number of its committed operations, both sovereign and non-sovereign, will be supporting climate change by 2030, climate change management. And climate finance from ADB's own resources aims to reach $80 billion for the period, essentially the coming decade, to 2019 to 2030. ADB wants to ramp up its adaptation finance as a fraction of its total climate finance. Because in 2020, out of the $5 billion that was committed to climate finance, 80% went for mitigation, mainly in renewable energy and energy efficiency. So adaptation projects have been left behind in terms of volume of climate finance, and that is something that ADB wants to correct, following the example of World Bank and the other MDBs. And that's where as well nature-based solutions are an important component. And the benefits of nature-based solutions are many. They provide sustainable and cost-effective options with multiple benefits, and that's important to emphasize. Multiple benefits from restoring ecosystems and promoting sustainable development. The applications are wide range and across all thematic areas and sectors, including water, urban, transportation, agriculture, and climate resilience as well. So ADB sees NBS as really a new infrastructure asset class, if you like, targeted specifically for building resilience and helping reframe the approach to development to reflect a broader cross-cutting system-based thinking. It has a wide range of application to different sectors, as I described. But instead of describing these applications to you, it would be better to visualize them in the next two slides. Remember, our aim here is not so much to appreciate the innovations and variety of solutions under NBS and the resilience value, but to begin to consider the challenges for private sector participation in particular, especially under PPP modalities. And these challenges would include standardization and measurement of outputs, allocating costs and benefits, assigning risks, and other project structuring challenges that perhaps in the concluding slides we will have a chance to discuss. So these are three examples of nature-based solutions. These are schematic drawings for ease of communication, but actual photos you will find in the literature, including the one I cited in the footnote. So in the upper left, you have the well-known make room for the river approach, pioneered in the Netherlands, and in the recent flooding in Central Europe has proven its value and effectiveness again. And that is basically allowing room for the river to use its floodplain to detain flooding and release it more slowly, instead of building bigger conveyance infrastructure and trying to evacuate the water as soon as possible. In the upper right is a diagram to show a natural process using wetlands for cleaning stormwater in urban spaces, and with the added advantage of providing green areas and access to nature. And in the bottom, you see the concept of sponge cities popularized in China. There are now 16 districts there that are showcasing this, and they range an application to site design and regional approaches to reduce flooding, increase water supply with improved quality, and mitigate urban heat island effect. So essentially, sponge city, as the term implies, is having the ability for a city to absorb the water instead of just disposing it as quickly as possible through conventional infrastructure. Just three more examples. We have here on the upper left a coastal protection approach that integrates ecosystem restoration. You see here the mangroves with protection from stronger surges and coastal flooding, again with multiple benefits to the infrastructure and even livelihood enhancement. So imagine at the back of these mangroves you have a coastal road that needs to be protected. Used to be, we would have to raise that the very high road level to keep it out of flooding reach and the surge level, or build a huge embankment wall. On the right side, you have an example of watershed protection. It's not a new concept. Then this one is to reduce impacts on downstream facilities like hydropower and water storage systems, while also making the water cleaner and cheaper to treat. And in the bottom example, you see an approach of increasing groundwater recharge while managing floods. So an important theme to note here is the variety of it. And the multiple benefits from all these varied approaches, which is a great potential, but has its own, well, you might call it a challenge of how you standardize this so that it becomes easy for investors to appreciate them and compare one thing from another. ADB's approach to NBS then is anchored on science. It's comprehensive and systematic. Basically, the logic of doing an assessment of the setting and the threats, pretty much along the lines that Craig described on assessing risk, then developing the options, piloting and testing them and integrating them in the project cycle, essentially. So in my next slides, I've labeled them by section. Section 1 will just speak to ADB's system resilience framework. Second is the landscape approach that is fitted to that. The third is the case study. And the fourth one is how do we meet this challenge of making the business case for private sector investment in nature-based solutions. So holistic approach is the hallmark of this, based on a systems thinking, strengthening of adaptation through green and gray solutions, scaling up the investments, and ultimately bringing a transformational change through resilience, meaning risk-informed integrated planning in much along the lines that Craig was explaining, and with increasing emphasis on nature-supported solutions. In the note below, you'll see some groups that I've named. The UCCRTF, the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, which operates under ADB's Urban Sector Group, has been working since 2014 across 80 cities and the 8 developing member countries of ADB. And we've had 60 projects implemented to date, and not all of them, but we're aiming to have a more significant number of projects testing out the NBS nature-based solution. And it might interest you to know as well that the Trust Fund is supporting the PPP Center of the Philippines to help provinces develop resilience plans that could provide a pipeline of projects suitable for private sector participation, including PPP modalities. And this speaks to that concern that Craig also mentioned about the upstream preparation. So part of the support is assisting the provinces develop a strong risk assessment and develop an option that can meet the test of private sector investment and under the PPP system of the country. And this is the resilience framework that I mentioned. The diagram on the right gives you basically a drawing of the 4 pillars in different colors, or call them foundations or basic principles. But there are 4, and the first one is that climate change and disaster risk must be considered together in planning and building infrastructure. So it's not just climate proofing anymore. In the past, the approach to adaptation has been mainly to strengthening the physical infrastructure by enlarging the pipes, enlarging the canals, which is rather counterintuitive to the objectives of using nature as a complementary solution to the problem. So instead of just climate proofing, now I think I see that the aim of this framework is to put a stronger emphasis on ecosystem-based solutions, nature-based solutions as part of an overall strategy. And you will see in the diagram in my slide, I have this plus sign, which is to say that the approach is to combine them. These are not to be separate solutions, but they should complement each other. And in fact, the economics will favor such combination. The third one is the focusing on the social and institutional dimensions. This is important to ADB, not just because of the mutually reinforcing nature of poverty and vulnerability, which is the bank's mission to mitigate. But in terms of marketing nature-based solutions, we have a larger set of stakeholders with their own views on what is interesting to them and what they're willing to participate in. So being able to understand the so-called political economy of the social institutional context is very important, including stakeholder mapping. Who are the stakeholders? What are their interests, influence, and power? And how do you explain this nature-based project according to those respective mindsets? And the fourth one is providing a strong investment case. By that, we mean both the financial and the economic for building resilience, but also help strengthen financial preparedness for residual risks, especially natural disaster risks. And in the bottom right portion, you see a layered approach to how this is being pursued from the top, that is to say upstream in policy and convincing the governments that this is something worth their time to like to test for now and see if it works. But preparing projects is very important in a system frame, ensuring that the nature-based component is properly set, not just as an add-on, but as an integrated part of the solution, and then implementing and supporting them in the ground, initially through demonstrations. So that is that layered approach. Just a quick a few more notes on this. The framework must not give the impression that engineering and nature-based solutions are separate alternatives. In this frame, both are physical measures. Physical components include both engineering and nature-based, and non-physical then would pertain to the zoning, regulation, policies, and so on. And this above meaning of physical versus non-physical project components is pretty much aligned with how project development terminology is used in the bank anyway. And in order to do more nature-based solutions, the perspective must change from just focusing on the site of the investment to one that's more system defined, a landscape, in other words. Geospatial planning is very important in this context then. And this is where one of ADB's tools, it's called SPADE, for Spatial Data Explorer, is playing an important role in providing this kind of landscape context to inform about the risks as well as the opportunities for integrating nature-positive solutions in the design of interventions. And here, labeled 2 now, on the tools for landscape analysis. This is just two images of the inundation that typhoon that hit the Philippines in 2020 caused, and we find this very effective in getting people's attention to why this is something that is of concern, why climate has changed, and it impacts we are now seeing, and we need to do something about it. The visualization and analysis of spatial data, which is now called location intelligence, is important in this approach to help people, stakeholders, see problems in new ways, especially when combined with the processing power and speed these days of machine learning and artificial intelligence. This is an example of one of the capabilities of within SPADE, and that is flat extent mapping using AI, and in fact using Google Earth Engine in this case, where the program is able to detect what areas were flooded by comparing before and after satellite images, so that it's more clearly defined as in the image on the right. And final example on the tool part is the green-gray opportunity map, an example in now rendered in GIS, where it's it's easier to explain to stakeholders where the opportunities are and how all this might link together in a regional plan, even as a context for the nature-based solutions. So let me go to the case, and this is a master plan on the development of New Clark City. The city is a planned new community. Essentially, this is a greenfield development. It's currently under development. It's located within in the map. You'll see Clark Special Economic Zone in the main island of Luzon in the Philippines, and this covers the New Clark City part of this economic zone is about 9,500 hectares. And it's planned to accommodate up to 1.2 million people. The area is managed by an authority called the Basis Conversion and Development Authority. There was a design competition for the master plan in the city, which was held in 2015, just before the groundbreaking was held in 2016. And that master plan was the subject of a study that we made, that our trust fund supported to look for opportunities to integrate nature-based solutions. So the vision for New Clark City is to become a model of urban adaptation and resilience, using the river as a centerpiece for development. This entails providing more open space for the river to carry flood flows along the lines of making room for the river, but also using the open space to preserve the area's rich biodiversity and create a distinct identity, a competitive one for the city, to make it attractive to investors and, more importantly, develop actual guidelines to align physical development with green infrastructure. You see this stadium in the photo is actually one of the facilities already built in the area. A background to the relation to the PPP item. In 2017, BCBA and ADB signed an agreement through the ADB's Office of Public-Private Partnership for the latter to provide transaction advisory in the development of selected infrastructure packages within this, specifically the government center. And this agreement was following a receipt of a proposal, unsolicited proposal actually, from a Malaysian firm for the development of that government center. So in support of this agreement, the trust fund provided funds to review the master plan, and it concluded with recommendations to allow more open space to accommodate the flood flow in the river, rather than the structural approach in the master plan, and to apply more sustainable nature-based solutions. I'm happy to say that the area authority has been very receptive to this, and that in fact it's the recommendations, some of them have been adopted, which I'd like to show you in the next slides. This is the aerial view. You see it's mostly a greenfield area, but you see here at the top right already the developed part is the government center with the stadium, which was used in the 2019 Southeast Asia Games, and the development is ongoing. This river is what we're talking about. And in the original master plan, adopted the conventional gridded urban layout, the idea was to channelize the river, meaning to more or less align it within this grid, and to confine the river within embankments. So the review study felt that this is not the best solution, frankly. And in fact, with climate change, there is a high risk that embankment failure could happen under future extreme events. And so on the left side, and we don't need to go through this in detail, you see the predicted depth of that the water level will go to the different frequencies. So with an embankment height of 3 meters, not a very low one, therefore a very expensive, quite an expensive one. So the adverse impacts of this, it would accelerate the discharge of floodwater indeed downstream, evacuate the water very quickly. But it would pose a risk of flooding as well to the towns below. and it would reduce the natural capacity of the river, the floodplain, to detain flood and also to recharge the aquifers. And what equally important, it would remove any opportunity to develop the area, for example, the riverbank as a green zone, and remove the opportunity to brand the city as a green city. And the high infrastructure cost of the embankments was obvious from the estimates. The master plan review then recommended to develop and take advantage of the river's natural capacity to detain floods. The NBS solution would reduce construction costs, and it would create space to develop a green zone and establish the city as a green city for competitive branding, and it would sustain future groundwater supply. So this was the case that was made to the stakeholders. And this slide gives you an idea of the cost of if the embankments option had been adopted. It would have entailed higher costs for building bridges. One, because you need to have a longer approach to them as compared to one which uses the river flood banks as a storage for runoff. So the adopted nature positive approach was to keep the natural river meander and not build these embankments. And yes, develop the river side in this example as a park where people can have access to nature, and would give a good sense of why this city is a green city and mark that as its brand.
Ramon, in interest of time management,
yes.
Could you start wrapping up?
Okay, I will. And let me then just skip this part and take you to another aspect of this development is piloting of an affordable housing site, which is seen to be a potential item for public-private partnership under Philippine laws. And they're now looking at two modalities. So one, an incorporated JV with a joint venture company, and the other through contractual JV. So this developments in New Clark City have fitted themselves as well, not only to NBS solutions, but to private sector, potential private sector participation. Let me just make this fourth one, making the case. The economics of combining green and gray infrastructure is pretty solid, and it can be shown that there is an optimum combination that minimizes the cost, and that combined gray and green infra can be more cost effective in that sense, lower cost. And also there is a broader set of benefits that are monetary as well as non-monetary, even though they are non-market. And therefore, in assessing the viability of these investments, one needs to look at both the economic case, for there is a lot of benefits that can only be economically valued but may not have monetary returns. So both in that case, economic and financial support needs to be strong, and the latter is critical to PPP. Benefits are in the form of savings. Savings from O&M, for example. Avoided cost of future damage is a big one. And we introduced this term, co-benefits. We must account for this, expressed in either monetary or non-monetary terms. And for that, we have to go beyond conventional economic methods and use multi-criteria evaluation approaches. But always, the assessment will need to be site-based. But the investment case, and the example on the left is the one that's for the Central Park, creating an identity, connectedness, inclusivity. But on the right are some of the key items of making the case, combining because of economic efficiency. And we have a framework for that. Integrating NBS enhances resilience because of its innate capacity to adapt to changing climate. And the relative ease of nature-based solutions in terms of reversibility compared with hard engineering solutions. And nature-based solutions is multifunctional. generating many positive environmental and social impacts, so-called co-benefits, and integrates well with decision-making under uncertainty, especially in this time of great climate uncertainty, and empowers communities to be more involved in project operations, even though that entails a higher transaction cost.
Ramon,
so my last slide, my last slide, if I may, just on reflections from ADB's experience on the challenges. That nature-based solutions estimation methods are not standardized. So it's quite difficult to quantify the whole gamut of economic and financial benefits coming from it. So they all lump up under the term co-benefits, but estimating that and bringing that to bear on the assessment remains a challenge. There is a lack, second bullet, of standards for evaluating the performance of NBS in terms of outputs. And if you were to look at the statistical databases of where these NBS are, you're hard pressed to find them. So if you're an investor, how do you compare these potential opportunities for investing? It requires a high level entry point because it cannot just be tacked on to a project downstream. It needs government support to even look at integrating NBS in the investment portfolios. So it requires working at the far upstream into the country partnership strategies. And there is the asymmetrical influence of public works and environment agencies in the member countries where the public works do not quite see yet how they can bring in NBS in their traditional portfolio. For the project officers of ADB, the concern is complexity of the project. So what it introduces by way of complexity, more components and the longer project preparation time. And if you add the PPP modality, which in the Philippines takes at least 2 years to take through to financial close, then this concern is really quite important to address. So there is a need to further strengthen the investment case, the financial and economics, but also the operability within the business case of the bank.
Ramon, we'll have to stop there. We are out of time.
Okay. Sorry for taking time. I'm stopping sharing and back to you and welcome the discussion.
Thank you
for your attention.
Thank you for your very illustrative examples. I'm going to open the floor to general questions as well as a chance also if you have any specific questions for Ramon. I have seen some that have come through. But Craig, I just wanted to ask you if you had a specific question for Ramon that that his presentation made you think about that would be helpful.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Ramon, for the presentation. It's a fascinating topic, something that we're looking at closely at EBRD as well. I think it's always great to have opportunities to learn between the different multilateral banks. So I have a question which is about the procurement of services, technical services for nature-based solutions. One of the challenges that we foresee, and to some degree which we already experience, is indeed there is progress in conceptually planning nature-based solutions and their integration into infrastructure investments. We, I suppose, look towards the implementation, and how can we ensure that we have the service providers in the downstream chain of all the work that needs to be done, the detailed design, the implementation, the sourcing of materials, the construction, and the myriad of of procurement processes and contracts and subcontracts that that we have when we're financing an infrastructure investment. How do you see any barriers in terms of the availability of service providers, consulting firms, engineering firms, providers of materials that will be able to actually provide the downstream services and equipment and material for delivering nature-based solutions at scale? Because we wonder whether it's a bottleneck that we can design these fantastic nature-based solution projects, but when we then finance them on the ground, will we find that we've got the knowledge, the firms, the capacity on the ground to actually deliver the project in that way? And do you think there's anything that MDBs can do to start to develop those capacities to build the marketplace for the provision of the services that we'll need for scaled up investment in NBS infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Craig. Indeed, that is an important hurdle, if you like, that needs to be surmounted. Having a set of projects that can be taken to actual implementation. And so I come back to the issue of project development preparation. And that, as I indicated in one of my slides, needs to start from really the very top, at the policy level of the government. Have that kind of appreciation that it comes into the country partnership strategy that ADB and the bank will support, and then take it down to the local level. The thing is that we cannot develop capacities and instruments just at the national level, because many of these NBS solutions are very context dependent on the location, on the particular municipality or city. So we need to work at the two levels, having this support at the national level, but developing the mechanisms that will allow local government units to actually take this through to implementation. Their ideas to implementation, for which they do not have much information and capacity. And that is where the bank, the trust fund is supporting, as an example again, the Public Partnership Center of the Philippines to develop this capacity through a project development facility, which is contributed to by the fund. And that helps local governments develop a pipeline, identify the opportunities for private sector participation, specifically including PPP modalities, either under BLT variants or joint venture alternatives. But in other words, create a case so that the nature-based solution is truly embedded in the design, and that there are metrics for it so that it can be appreciated by potential investors, as well as the bodies that will need to approve those projects and procurement down the line. I hope I took a bit of from your question, Craig. So that I see is the project, the preparation, is setting the context for that to actually happen in a way that makes a strong investment case, and in particular under PPP modalities, remains a challenge.
Thank you very much. I see there are questions popping up fast and furiously now. Before we do, Craig, we want to make sure that you're not left out of this end discussion. One thing that you had mentioned about was institutional investors, getting involved in green bonds, etc. And, one of the potential biggest investors possibly could be the insurance industry. And, they have a direct interest in this. Is there anything you can share with us, on the receptivity of the insurance industry to green bonds? Have they been involved? Are there outsiders looking in? I'll leave that open to you.
Then they're involved, absolutely, and in different ways. I mean, insurance companies, they are also big investors, and insurance companies are very active participants in bond markets, including green bond markets. So we certainly see that many insurance companies are indeed very active. In our climate resilience bond issuance, I think I showed on one of my slides a little pie chart, and I think from memory it's something like maybe 20% of the total finance raised came from insurance companies as investors, investing in those bond issuances. I'm not going to name names because you can probably know who some of them are, but some of the world's biggest insurance companies are extremely active and extremely influential as institutional investors in green bond markets. So there's that whole side of insurance companies as investors, and yes, indeed, they are extremely active. But I think there's then the other side of insurance, which is, you know, the business side of insurance, which I think many insurance companies are seeing as being, you know, strategically a shift. I think many insurance companies are seeing this as kind of a new direction, perhaps a kind of an opportunity for providing more and different forms of cover and insurance. So I think there is definitely a role for insurance. I think that insurance-based mechanisms can be very important for de-risking investments, where, again, as I said earlier, the thing that nobody wants is when you don't know and you don't understand the risk. You know, what is more preferable is when you do recognize the risk, you can size it, you can price it. I think a lot of insurance companies are paying a lot of attention to that aspect, which is how can we get better at recognizing, sizing, and pricing climate risk, including physical climate risk, because if you can de-risk investments in that way, you can then unlock investment. But I also come back to another point I made earlier, which is that there are limits. This isn't the silver bullet. It's a mechanism, it's not the mechanism. And there will be many sorts of investments, and there will, as I said, there will be certain geographies and certain sectors where there are limits to how far these kind of market-based mechanisms can go, and there will be cases where there will be very strong needs and justification for other forms of intervention, including governments, including international organizations, and including the use of deeper concessionality, where we have those deeper residual risks that the market alone cannot address.
Thank you very much. Omar Saif, if you have your video on, as well as your, if you've unmuted, you asked a question earlier on about overcoming the stigmas attached to nature-based solutions with modern infrastructure. If you could please ask that question in detail.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David. I think my question comes in reference particularly to the region that I'm based in. So in the Gulf region, we found that a lot of the operating agencies, you know, things for like wastewater or some of the municipalities, they're quite hesitant when it comes to nature-based solutions. And oftentimes it's because they have this drive to really install the most advanced wastewater treatment systems or whatever it may be. So because of that, there's this over reliance on modern infrastructure, or whereas they see nature-based solutions as being something that's more for developing countries, or you know, those that don't have the monetary means to install more modern systems. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that in terms of how do we change that kind of mindset?
So
yeah, I think that's really a very difficult challenge, because up to now we can't really point to very strong proof of concept, if you like, that will change this preference for proven solutions, as engineers would like to call them, perhaps, on solving climate challenges. So we can conceptualize on paper anyway a strong argument for why combining a traditional hard infrastructure with green solutions makes sense economically. But then taking this down to, okay, now that you've said there are plenty of benefits, by the way, how do we assign these benefits to those who need to pay for them? And how do you structure it? As opposed to a traditional gray infrastructure, it's very clear who owns it, who pays for it, who maintains it. In a gray-green infrastructure, it will be a broader discussion. So yeah, it's complex, to use that word. And therefore, if you are the public works agency and somebody tells you, well, now the footprint of our planning will be quite big, our landscape. And by the way, we will involve this many stakeholders with their own viewpoints on how this should go, and then craft a structure with who pays and how do you share the benefits. That's truly daunting. So I have no quick answer to you, and that remains the challenge for how It's not to say that it's not worth trying, because it's also not a good solution to just keep enlarging our built infrastructure to saying that it will handle climate change impacts. We really need nature positive solution. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much. Jeff, you had a question early on about technical support that could come from the ADB or the, even EBRD when it comes to adapting or adopting these practices. Could you please ask your question? And this would be directed to both to Craig as well as Ramon. It's open to either of you to answer or both to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. I'd like to thank Ramon and Craig for really great presentations today. I guess the premise of my question is that normally countries like us in the Philippines would need transaction advisors to help us develop these infrastructure projects. And the way we normally go about it is to procure transaction advisors. And thanks to the support like that of UCC RTF of the ADB, or perhaps some other multilateral banks, we get to have that support and capacity to actually develop these types of projects, centering on nature-based solutions and climate change resiliency. But, even these support are limited because they cannot definitely support all the infrastructure requirements of a particular country. I guess from a public sector point of view, my question is, how do we, as public sector officers, ensure that we get or we shape the right TORs such that even without these support from multilateral banks, we would be able to do it on our own. Of course, that is an assumption that the secret is crafting the right TORs. But specifically, like, what are the practical tips that you could give us? Is there a specific set of specialists that we need to be procuring, or is it a matter of just adding a particular section on how project development chapters in FSS will have to be done? So perhaps your insights would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
I will let Craig. Would you like to take that first, Craig?
I think as it's your region and even your country, Ramon, I think I'd probably be more appropriate for you to go first if you don't mind.
Yeah, I would then refer to the project development facility that's been set up, as you know, Jeff, in the PPP Center. And that, in other words, the skill that we need of the people who man this are not just the project structuring abilities to develop contractual arrangements, packaging of PORs. That's actually already midstream. But we need a capacity to conceptualize the projects from a good start. In other words, embed this thinking in the infrastructure program and see what are the hurdles that need to be addressed here, including selling it to a variety of stakeholders. All need to be represented. So I think that project development facility needs to be broader than financial structuring support. It has to really go upstream into setting up the proper case and mobilizing the right people to support it. Green gray infrastructure will probably have complex financing as well. The blending of investments from the public side, because many of the benefits are public goods, but also the direct benefits from the infrastructure that is supported and made more sustainable for the private side, including even these impact investors who are supporting climate resilience missions to be looking for projects that they can invest in. As Craig was saying, there's really a dearth of projects that are attractive in this sense, that it can attract such kind of blended financing.
Thank you very much. We have 1 minute. Craig, if you do want to make a little closing comment on that so that I can wrap up.
Just very briefly, I mean, I fully agree with Ramon. I don't want to, our experience may be a bit different from that of the Philippines, so I'm not going to say too much, but maybe one point, which is to say that one thing we've learned, and I think here of the long-term relationships that we've had with many of our municipal clients, is, you know, we need to think about building these kinds of capacities for project preparation and good project management, not necessarily on a project-by-project basis, but more on a long-term basis. And about, you know, I think one thing we've learned is that it's important for us as an MDB to develop a long-term partnership with our, for example, municipal clients. And yes, indeed, we do provide support for the implementation of projects, but we also provide what we call kind of operational and capacity support to the entity, which could be, for example, a municipality, or it could be a roads agency, or it could be an irrigation agency. And I think as well as thinking about the project, we have to think about the long-term capacity, helping that client to get better at its financial planning, at its procurement, at its internal organizational arrangement. So the kind of organizational capacity building of the client, which will then be of benefit for multiple transactions going through into the future. So maybe not just about the support for delivering the project, but the support for building the capacity of the client so that then they have those capacities in the longer term for multiple investments and multiple projects.
Thank you very much. So in wrapping up, I'd just like to point out a number of highlights or mentions that were made. You know, really, Craig, I did appreciate the fact of tying climate risk to, you know, financial risk. That's critically to understand that relationship. It's also, you know, really important that, you know, we look at alternative forms of investment and alternative institutional investors. I did like your comment that, you know, what we're doing is not a silver bullet, but it is a set of, you know, opportunities to look at different mechanisms for investment. Thank you also very much to Ramon for your discussions on you know, the green, blue, and gray infrastructure, how they can be related to one another. Also looking at a brownfield project and taking it further. I did appreciate you mentioning that there's differences between brownfield and greenfield projects. And then also, you know, working with communities and working with governments in a holistic approach. And I think that your Clark City project was very illustrative, and especially the diagrams on showing how some of this nature-based solution infrastructure looks. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the participants, for the questions as well. I was a little worried at first where everyone was quiet, but we started getting a lot of questions at the end, and thank you very much for that. Wish everyone a great day, and I'm going to hand over to Danilo of GCA to make any final statements or comments he wishes to make. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Craig and Ramon, for those two very insightful presentations, and also all the participants for the discussions. Besides the interaction, also in the questions, I was happy to see that you were also discussing with each other in the chat. So I hope that you can continue that in the next